All right, so throughout the entire negotiation process surrounding this $3.5 trillion infrastructure package, I've been telling you guys about some of the best aspects of this package, one of which is the federal government finally getting the ability to directly negotiate drug prices on behalf of the American people, instead of just having a system where big pharma companies that make billions of dollars a year are able to just set whatever arbitrary price they want. And no surprise, under a for-profit model, that is just going to mean them price gouging the American people for as much as they physically can and running out the back door with all of the profits. And it won't surprise you guys that this has resulted in the US paying up to 256% higher for prescription drugs than other developed countries around the world. And you can see specifically US prescription drug prices were 218% of prices in Canada, 170% of prices in Mexico, 779% of prices in Turkey, and 209% of prices in Japan. So we're paying more than the entire rest of the developed world for prescription drug prices. And again, this is because we have a system where gigantic pharma companies are able to just decide whatever the fuck they want to charge people. It doesn't have to be tied to anything reasonable in any way, shape, or form. So having the federal government negotiate on our behalf would be a good thing that would lower those costs. And so this is something that was included in the $3.5 trillion infrastructure package, and we have been running into a hurdle on this issue. So what is the hurdle? Well, we just had a committee vote on this specific issue, and 3 Democrats basically blocked it. There is a committee that is almost nearly split between Democrats and Republicans. There were 3 Democrats who decided to go against this bill, and those 3 Democrats were Schrader, Rice, and Peters, and we're going to get to them a little bit more in a bit here. But the vote on drug negotiations in Medicare fails 29-29 in a tie, with those 3 Democrats sinking it. So it was a tie vote because of these 3 Democrats. So in other words, if you had another Democrat who supported this bill, somebody like, I don't know, AOC, and we're going to get into that, then this would have actually passed, right? But what were the arguments that they were putting forward to opposing this? Well, here is Scott Peters from California arguing that letting Medicare negotiate prices will undermine pharmaceutical innovation from today's markup. So this is what is always used by big pharma shills and the politicians who are paid by big pharma to go and say these things. And we're going to get into the actual data and the reasoning why it actually doesn't stifle innovation. And in fact, if we were to nationalize our big pharma industry, then it would lead to more innovation and better results for all of us, because it would not only lead to more innovation, but it would also lower costs for everybody. And we're going to get into that in a second here. But back to this 29-29 tie vote. So again, the 3 names that blocked this from happening were Schrader, Rice, and Peters. Now, one of those, Kathleen Rice, was put in this position by Nancy Pelosi over AOC. This was a position that AOC was actively trying to get from Nancy Pelosi, but Kathleen Rice beats out AOC for spot on coveted House committee. The fight over a seat on the Energy and Commerce panel carries implications for policy and power in Congress, and we are now starting to see the implications of something like this happening. So why did this happen? Why didn't AOC get this position? Well, it was basically because AOC was putting together strategies or campaigns to try to unseat corporate Democrats in favor of progressive candidates, and Nancy Pelosi didn't like that, and so she basically fucked over AOC and stabbed her in the back and did not let her have this position. If Nancy Pelosi had put AOC in this spot on this House committee, then that bill would have passed, okay? The prescription drug negotiations would have passed if AOC was on this, but she obviously wasn't, and that is really Nancy Pelosi's fault, if anybody is to blame. Now, let's go back to these original arguments. So what were these 3 Democrats deciding is the reason why we can't have the government negotiate drug prices? Well, they said it was going to stifle innovation. Well, what do these companies actually spend their money on? Is it research and development? No. New report here from July of 2021. New report reveals Big Pharma spends more on stock buybacks, dividends, and executive compensation than research and development. In addition to that, they also spend more on marketing than research and development. So when all of these gigantic for-profit billion-dollar pharma companies are telling you, we need all of this money so that we can go in research and development and we can innovate new medicines for you guys and then give them to you, that's not at all what's actually happening here, okay? They're patenting technology that was largely funded through the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, in other words, funded and researched by the government, and then they buy up these patents for these different medicines, and then they turn around and they price gouge everybody for the medicines, And then they spend that on marketing, and they spend that on stock buybacks and dividends and executive compensation. So none of these gigantic pharma companies are innovating in any way, shape, or form. If anything, they're just taking the innovations that were developed in a public way and then privatizing them and price gouging everybody for those innovations. And so again, the data, the evidence, the actual things that they're spending their money on suggest that nationalizing big pharma would actually lead to more innovation, okay? Not less innovation, okay? If you take the profit motive out of this, what does that mean? It basically just means you're not spending millions and millions or billions of dollars on funneling money into these executives' pockets, and you can instead invest that actually on research and development. In addition, you obviously wouldn't have to be spending money on marketing. And so continuing, what is the actual reason why these Democrats oppose it if it is not genuinely for research and development and innovation? Well, hear from Andrew Perez and David Sirota. Big Pharma's Democrats. So the three House Democrats working to kill drug price legislation raked in nearly $1.6 million from pharma donors, and the top aide for one of them is now a pharma lobbyist. So here's some of the details on this. So the three conservative Democratic lawmakers threatening to kill their party's drug pricing legislation have raked in roughly $1.6 million of campaign cash from donors in the pharmaceutical and health products industries, and one of the lawmakers is the House's single largest recipient of pharma industry campaign cash this election cycle, and another lawmaker's immediate past chief of staff is now lobbying for drug makers. And the threat from Democratic representatives Kurt Schrager from Oregon, Scott Peters from California, and Kathleen Rice from New York comes just as the pharma industry's top lobbying group announced a 7-figure ad campaign to vilify the Democratic legislation that aims to lower the cost of medicines for Americans now facing the world's highest prescription drug prices. So I wonder if that $1.6 million in campaign cash has anything to do with these Democrats now coming out and opposing legislation that would hurt the very people who donated that $1.6 million of campaign cash. And listen, Rashida Tlaib said it the best on this. If Democrats allow these motherfuckers to sink this part of the bill, which would really potentially, as we're going to get to here, sink the entire bill, then basically what they're telling their constituents is that this promise of us lowering prescription drug prices that we have been promising for over a decade now can't happen because of $1.6 million of campaign cash from the big pharma lobbyists, okay? That's the message that Democrats are sending if they allow these people to succeed, which obviously would be a disastrous message to be sending, especially leading into 2022, obviously. But the additional implication of this is potentially tanking the entire bill. So they say the trio of big pharma Democrats are jeopardizing a plan based on H.R. 3, the Elijah Cummings Lower Drug Costs Now Act, and the Congressional Budget Office has said that the drug pricing legislation, named for Elijah Cummings of Maryland, would save the government $456 billion and reduce prices by 57% to 75% relative to current prices for various medicines. So $456 billion is part of what Democrats are claiming they're going to use to fund this bill, okay? Again, I'm a subscriber to modern monetary theory. We're not going to get into that, but they are claiming they need that almost $500 billion to pay for this bill, essentially. And so if you need that $500 billion by implementing this part of the bill, then by opposing this part of the bill, you are effectively tanking the entire bill, because that takes off $500 billion from the table that could be used to go fund other measures. And they continue saying the measure would direct federal health regulators to negotiate drug prices of 25 high-priced drugs in the first year of implementation and 50 drugs in subsequent years, and the new negotiated prices would be available through both Medicare and private insurers. So it's pretty good. And in addition to that, the vast majority of the American people are behind the Democrats who are supporting this, right? So even a majority of Republicans support Medicare negotiations for prescription drug prices. It's upwards of like 90% of the entire country. So it's basically, do you want to support 90% of the American people who want to pay less for drugs, or do you want to support the big pharma industry, the executives, the CEOs that are making billions of dollars? So it's not a complicated issue, and I'll just leave you off here with a good tweet that I think summarizes it from Warren Gunnels here. As these supposed centrist Democrats are opposing this, he says, when 81% of Americans support requiring Medicare to negotiate with the pharma industry to lower the price of prescription drugs, opposing this policy does not make you a centrist or a moderate. It makes you a radical whose views are totally outside the mainstream, and he is 100% correct here. These people are not moderates. They are not centrists. They are far-right extremists who are siding with gigantic pharma companies over the American people who desperately need and want to spend less on prescription drugs.